A lot of people asking how this latest Ebola patient got to the United States without being flagged. What we've learned is that Thomas Eric Duncan, a 42-year-old man from Liberia, was screened for fever at the airport when he left. In fact, he was screened 3 times, and he wasn't ill until several days after getting here. But Liberia has said, look, it wants to prosecute Duncan because they say he lied during the screening when he was asked questions at the airport. They say he didn't reveal that he, in fact, had been exposed to an Ebola patient, a woman that he helped a few days prior. Now, I want to put this whole issue to one of the best minds working on this problem, the whole problem of beating this Ebola outbreak, Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He's the guy we turn to often. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Fauci. You've heard the story as well. It sounds like Liberia is going to prosecute Mr. Duncan for not revealing that he had this contact with the woman who later died. What about the United States? What's our role in handling someone like Mr. Duncan?
Well, handling him is what actually happened. There were obviously some missteps, but first, when you identify someone who is here, and we had said several times that inevitably we were going to have someone who got on a plane without symptoms, which would get them through the screening process that this individual got through when he left from Liberia. And then once here, our role is, our capability is to be able to identify and isolate the person as quickly as you possibly can, give them the appropriate treatment, and importantly, begin the very meticulous process of contact tracing, which is the fundamental mechanism whereby you prevent an outbreak. So from the standpoint of what we would do is exactly what we did, obviously without some of the rough points that occurred during that process.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways maybe I'm asking more of a legal question, but I'm just curious because the scenario could be that people will know that they've been exposed, they're not sick yet, but get on planes and come to the United States for treatment. You can understand that, Dr. Fauci, because treatment's so hard to get over there and getting any kind of care. This may happen more and more. Is this something the United States has given thought to, or your department's given thought to, in terms of, did we just take all those patients? Is there going to be anything else done?
Well, of course, obviously, you're always continually reevaluating the situation. The only difficulty is there is that window. Now, clearly, if someone is exposed and has symptoms and wants to come to the United States for treatment, they are not going to be able to get on a plane. They will be stopped at the airport at the West African countries on that end of the process. The window, that's the vulnerable window, is someone who is exposed and then winds up with no symptoms for a period of time that could be as many as 21 days, and then does get on the plane being asymptomatic. There's really not much that you can do except rely on that screening of symptoms and fever. And every once in a while, it is conceivable, as has happened by the reality of the Duncan case, that someone will slip through during the asymptomatic period.
I want to talk a little bit about what I think seems to be the biggest concern for a lot of people, and this idea of who are contacts. In Dallas, for example, for everyone who's deemed a contact, we know that a health official is coming in twice a day, taking their temperature, checking for fever. So a few questions around that. First of all, can you be contagious without having a fever?
If you look at the kinetics of studies, and this is a very important question, the answer to that is no. You never say 100%, but it's essentially 100%. And the reason is you don't get the ability to isolate virus until the person develops symptoms. So you have a period of time of a window where the person clearly is infected. There's no doubt about that. But the virus starts to become isolatable at the time that the person develops symptoms. Because of that, you can make a reasonable conclusion that that person will not be able to transmit it. Again, in biology, nothing is 100%, but that's quite a reasonable conclusion to make.
And fever is oftentimes the first symptom, is that? I mean, that's what they're using to screen at airports. That if you see a fever, is that going to be the first symptom, or might they have other things first?
Again, not 100%, but again, if you look at a group of patients, almost invariably, fever is the thing that signals the onset. Now, you may get a bit of achiness before you actually spike the fever, but they're very closely juxtaposed. So if a person has a fever, that really is the signal that that person is infected, if in fact they do have Ebola. That's what you usually see. And as with all fevers, fevers are generally associated with chills and aches and a feeling of malaise due to the cytokine release, that inflammatory proteins that get released when you get a fever.
We place a lot of faith in on this idea of screening and especially using fever, but we also know that we can mask a fever using medications, Tylenol, aspirin, things like that. So if someone wanted to basically disguise their fever, couldn't they just take some medication and get through airport screening?
Certainly that's a possibility. And the point that you're making from a number of different angles is that nothing is 100%. You have to look at probabilities and the likelihood of someone getting a fever, hiding their fever. Of course, those are all possibilities. Those are hypotheticals. Unlikely that that would happen. If someone has a spike in a fever, you'll probably still see a degree of temperature elevation.
Okay. I mean, and I'm pointing out some of how the screening works, but obviously there are limitations to it. And let me just give a quick reminder again to your point for people of what these symptoms are. Early on, generally includes a fever, sometimes headache also, muscle aches, weakness, just feeling lousy. As it progresses, you see vomiting, diarrhea. Oftentimes you see a rash. That can be a characteristic rash. There can be internal and even external bleeding in some cases. Also red eyes. That can sometimes be a sign of the bleeding as well. But in any case, we've been told very definitively that a person cannot infect others before they are actually sick. And I think that's a fundamentally important point. All the people who came across Mr. Duncan before he fell ill, they have nothing to worry about. Is that right? And I just want to be 100% clear on this. The people on the planes and in the airports where he traveled, all of that, they had, Dr. Friedman said 0% chance of being infected.
By all evidence that we have, when a person is not symptomatic, they don't transmit. And that's the reason why when people do contact tracing, they focus on the contacts that have occurred from the time that the person was asymptomatic. And as we know, if you look at the course of Mr. Duncan, not only was he not with symptoms during the flight, but even several days after he landed and went from Dulles to Dallas, because he wasn't symptomatic until the 24th, which is 4 days after he had landed.
Always a pleasure, sir. An honor to have you on our program. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.